The jungle remembers what men forget. It began with rain that never stopped, not the kind that falls and ends, but a curtain that hangs between worlds, blurring everything human into one long sigh. The air itself was water, heavy, slow, ancient. The smell of rot and metal filled every breath. When the wind moved, it carried the echo of something burning, something that used to be alive. 7 soldiers moved through that haze, each step sinking into mud that tried to keep them. Their faces were wet and expressionless. Helmets dripped, rifles gleamed under the dim light. Sergeant Miller walked first, shoulders tight, eyes hidden under the shadow of his helmet. Behind him was Carter, restless, talking to fill the emptiness. Jenkins and Ford trudged next, then O'Hara and Thomas, men without names in the noise. Last came Daniel Reeves, the youngest, face still holding the softness of a man who hadn't learned how to hate. They had left behind a village, or what used to be one. Bamboo ribs still smoked. Chickens burned where they had fallen. The huts collapsed into themselves, turning to dark piles of cinder. The sky was the color of old metal. No one looked back, but the smell followed them like guilt. Ford spat into the mud. "No VC there, Sarge. Just old folks." Miller didn't answer. His jaw tightened. Carter laughed under his breath. "You think they tell you who's VC? Every hut's a trap. Every grandma's got a grenade in her skirt." Daniel said nothing. He tried to keep his eyes low, but his stomach twisted. The smoke clung to him. He could still see the shape of a child's shoe half buried in the ashes. When they reached the stream that cut through the trees, the squad stopped to rest. Rain tapped against helmets, small and steady. The forest steamed. The men lit cigarettes that hissed in the damp. Then a sound, soft, human, came from the edge of the clearing. "Jesus!" Jenkins whispered. "You hear that?" Miller raised a hand for silence. A shadow moved through the wreckage of a collapsed hut, something crawling, dragging itself out of the ash. It was a girl. She was young, her face streaked with mud and soot, her dress torn and hanging from one shoulder. She stared at them through a curtain of hair that stuck to her cheeks. No scream, no plea. Just breathing, shallow, steady. Miller's rifle lifted by reflex. One shot would end it clean. But Carter stepped forward, grinning. "Hold on, Sarge. She's alive. Could be a scout. Or maybe she knows something." He leaned closer, his smile widening. Hell. She might even be useful. Miller hesitated for a moment that lasted too long. Then he lowered the barrel. "Tie her. We'll take her back." They bound her wrists with radio wire. She didn't resist. Her eyes stayed on them, not empty, but watchful. Daniel felt it like heat on the back of his neck. By nightfall they reached their camp, a hollow carved into the trees, half canvas, half mud. The rain hadn't stopped. The light from their single lantern turned everything the color of rust. They pushed the girl into a corner of the shelter and forgot her. Carter opened a can of beans. Jenkins passed a bottle. The jokes came easy, the kind that die in laughter and are buried in silence. Daniel sat near the entrance, watching shadows move across the wet floor. When Carter's laugh broke into something sharper, Miller told them to quiet down. "Get some sleep," he said. "We move at dawn." But Daniel didn't sleep. He lay still, eyes open, listening to the rain, the murmur of voices, then something else, softer, broken. The sound came from the corner where the girl sat. It stopped as soon as he turned. He closed his eyes and hated himself for hearing. Morning came pale and gray. The fire hissed. The girl was still there, wrists swollen, hair tangled across her face. Miller barked orders. Carter kicked mud onto the fire, laughing. Daniel tried not to look at her, But her silence was louder than their noise. They would stay here for weeks, orders from command. Secure and hold. No one explained what they were securing, or from whom. The jungle didn't care. It grew back overnight, swallowing paths, covering tracks. The air was alive with wet leaves and unseen wings. The girl worked because they made her. She cooked, fetched water, washed their shirts in the stream. She didn't speak unless spoken to. When she did, her English was broken, but careful, like she was testing every word before letting it go. Carter started calling her Charlie's doll. Jenkins said she was good luck. Miller ignored them both. Sometimes Daniel caught her looking at the trees, like she was listening to something out there, something older than any of them. He began to watch her too, not the way the others did, just enough to notice the things they missed, the way she kept her hands close to her body, the way she moved slower when Carter was near, the way she flinched at laughter. At night, she hummed a tune so soft he thought he imagined it. It wasn't sadness. It was memory. One evening, after everyone had fallen asleep, Daniel stepped outside. The rain was thin now, falling in threads. He sat near the dying fire, watching the smoke twist through the trees. The girl appeared out of the dark, silent as mist. She held an old canteen in her bound hands. He reached for his own and poured water into it. "Here," he said. She hesitated. Her lips were cracked, her eyes half hidden under wet hair. "Why?" He shrugged. "Because you're thirsty." She looked at him for a long time. Then she drank. The sound of her swallowing was the only thing alive between them. When she handed the canteen back, she whispered, "War take everything." Daniel nodded. "It tries." She turned away, the outline of her shoulders small against the dark. When he looked again, she was gone. By morning she was back at the fire, stirring the pot as if nothing had happened. Carter called her lazy. Miller said nothing. But Daniel felt something shift, small, invisible, like the first drop before a storm. The days folded into one another until the calendar inside each man gave up and lay down. Morning meant wet boots. Afternoon meant steam rising from the ground as if the earth were exhaling. Night meant the slow parade of voices turning into echoes. Between those hours, the girl moved like a thin thread, stitching their camp together, fetching water, rinsing tin bowls, laying shirts over bamboo lines that never stayed dry. Daniel watched without standing out. He learned the rhythm of her steps, the way she measured distance from each man as if distance were a kind of armor. When Carter was near, she drifted closer to the fire so the others would see her. When Miller passed, she made herself smaller, not from fear, but because some silences demanded room. She never stepped behind Daniel. She always stayed where he could see her hands. On the fifth morning, Ford found a trail of small prints by the stream and cursed until his voice went hoarse. Miller followed the prints with his eyes and said, not unkindly, that animals needed water too. Carter laughed it off and asked what kind of animal needed a clay pot to carry home. The joke fell between them like a dull coin. No one picked it up. That evening the girl gathered leaves the color of dull jade and crushed them in her palms until green bled across her skin. She threw the paste into a wooden bowl and stirred with a stick. Jenkins wandered over, sniffed, and made a face. She said one word, medicine, and kept stirring. The men weren't sick, not really, only restless, but the idea of medicine soothed something primitive in them. Daniel wondered who the medicine was for. When she cooked, she sang. Never the whole song, only the spine of it, a soft thread that rose and fell without ever arriving. The tune made Carter sentimental enough to tell stories about home, and those stories made Jenkins cry in a way he disguised as laughter. Miller smoked and stared at the black wall of trees, counting distances no one else could see. Daniel sat near the edge of the lantern glow and let the sound work on him until he remembered his father's hands wrapping twine around tomato stakes, a summer before the war, on a day when the clouds lifted and the sky showed its belly like a tired animal. Miller sent Daniel and O'Hara to walk the perimeter. They moved slow, rifles cradled rather than aimed, boots sinking to the ankle in mud that smelled like old coins. The jungle did its best trick, pretending to be empty. No birds, no distant voices, only a hush that belonged to places where choices had been boiled down to yes or no. Daniel felt the hush in his knees. O'Hara broke it by talking about a girl he would marry in September if he lived that long. The jungle accepted the lie and kept walking beside them. When they returned, Carter had shaved a playing card into confetti and thrown it through the air as if it were snow. The girl swept the pieces together with a bunch of palm fronds. She did not look at Carter. She did not look away. Daniel noticed the quick calculation in her eyes, the kind of arithmetic you do when you're building a bridge inside your head, and praying the weight will hold when you cross. That night, she came to the tent flap and stood there as if she had always been part of the doorway. Daniel felt the shift before he saw her, the way the canvas gathered her shape like a skin. She entered without a sound and sat on the ground a pace beyond his reach. She did not touch him. She did not need to. Presence itself was contact in a place that rubbed people down to nothing. He asked nothing. She said nothing. The rain spoke for them, a steady language of forgiveness that never made a promise it couldn't keep. In the morning she returned to the stream with her pot and a bundle of leaves. Daniel followed a few minutes later, pretending he needed water, because pretense was the only safe way to tell the truth. She kneaded the leaves between her fingers and let the pulp cloud the surface. A minute later, a fish rose like a silver secret and surrendered itself to the bank. She did not smile. She only nodded once, as if acknowledging the fairness of an old rule. He thought of what she had said the first night, "War take everything," and realized she had left out the second clause, the hidden law of the place. War gives nothing back unless you take it. Carter began asking her to sit closer when the bottle came out. Jenkins, eager to belong to anything, would clap the air and make a space. She obeyed with a small tilt of the head that resembled gratitude. Daniel saw it for what it was: choreography, timing, the patience of the hunted. Each movement wrote a line on a map only she could read. She watched how quickly liquor loosened hands. She learned when the lantern sputtered. She tested how often Miller counted heads before sleep. She counted with him, but for a different reason. Miller watched Daniel watching the girl and said nothing for 2 days. On the third, he told Daniel to check the tripwire along the North Arc and walked with him among roots that looked like knotted wrists. After a while, the sergeant said that every man had a line he would not cross until he woke up one morning and found it behind him. He said mercy was just another kind of habit, and habits broke like anything else when weight found the seam. Daniel said he understood. Miller said he doubted it, and lit a cigarette he did not finish. When the radio died for half a day, the men performed the ritual of pretending they didn't care. Ford bragged he could hear artillery through the soles of his feet. O'Hara polished a ring he wore on a chain, and the ring reflected a face he refused to recognize. Carter carved his name into a bamboo pole and claimed the pole as proof of immortality. Jenkins asked the girl to tell him a story in her language. She spoke 3 sentences and stopped. He clapped anyway, because applause was the easiest lie and the cheapest kind of prayer. Daniel began sleeping lighter. He learned the weight of each footstep. Miller's confident and tired. Carter's quick and hungry. Jenkins vague. Ford's square. O'Hara's careful. Thomas's uncertain. The girl's step was almost nothing, a whisper that trusted the earth. Twice He woke to find she had left a cup of water near his bedroll, and twice he returned it to the fire without comment. He could not carry gifts from someone who had nothing left to spend. He thought about names, not hers. Hers was a door she kept shut. But his, Daniel. It sounded softer when the jungle said it back, like a word mended too many times. He doubted the boy who used to answer to it would recognize the man holding his rifle now. He doubted he would recognize the thought forming inside himself either, the one that did not know whose side he stood on when the counting started. He suspected the jungle had already chosen for him. When a wind from upriver brought the smell of another burned village, the men worked harder at ignoring it. Carter told a joke so filthy it looped back to innocence. Jenkins tripped on a root and called the root communist. Ford pulled a sliver from his palm and pretended it was a bullet he had caught bare-handed. The girl stood at the pot and stirred until the stew thickened. Daniel saw the tremor in her wrist and understood it wasn't fear. It was decision. That evening she placed a small bundle of dried leaves near the fire and sat where the light cut her face in half. She looked at the bundle, then at Daniel, then away. It was the most complicated sentence anyone had spoken all week. He answered by tightening the strap on his canteen and counting backward from 20 until the urge to speak passed. Words, he knew, could make enemies of people who might have saved each other if they had stayed quiet. Miller declared they would move in 2 days if the radio did not return. Carter declared they would celebrate the rumor of leaving. Jenkins declared he had never been happier anywhere in his life, which meant he was about to cry. The girl kept her head down and timed her breath to the sound of the ladle. Night came on thick. The lantern burned a smaller circle. Somewhere in the dark a fruit fell and opened itself on the ground. Daniel thought the sound resembled a heart deciding whether to go on. He looked at the girl and knew, without knowing how, that the shape of their days had reached its last uncomplicated edge. The jungle leaned closer. The rain paused as if to listen. The silence between the men and the woman they would not name learned a new kind of gravity. He could feel the weight of it finding the seam. By the next morning, the sky was the color of tin. The jungle exhaled steam that smelled of metal and sap. Every branch dripped. The men woke heavy, their movements slow and half-hearted. Carter cursed the damp that never ended. Jenkins laughed because complaining had become his way of measuring time. The girl moved among them, silent, pouring water into cups, handing out ration biscuits. No one thanked her. Gratitude was a luxury none of them could afford anymore. Daniel chewed the tasteless bread and watched. Her face was blank, but not vacant. It was the surface of still water hiding something deeper. He wondered when the line had blurred between pity and awe, between guilt and something that resembled hope. He told himself it was survival, the need to see one clean thing still standing. But he didn't believe it. The truth was simpler and crueler. He saw her as proof that not everything human had been burned away. Later that day, Miller gathered the squad near the radio tent. "Command's gone silent," he said. "We hold position until contact. Could be days." His voice carried the fatigue of someone who had spent too long being obeyed by men he no longer respected. The others nodded, eager for the smallest fragment of direction. Daniel noticed how Carter's eyes darted toward the girl, as if orders themselves were permission. When the rain came again, it came sideways, hammering the canvas, turning the camp into a cage of noise. The girl crouched by the fire pit, guarding the small flame inside a circle of stones. She worked with the patience of someone who had rebuilt the same light too many times. Daniel watched her hands, the deliberate calm, the rhythm. He realized that in her world, patience was the only weapon left. As dusk thickened, the rain softened to a mist. The men gathered around the fire, passing a dented bottle of rice liquor, the same one they'd been trading for weeks. Carter poured for each of them, and when he came to Daniel, his grin carried the edge of a dare. "Drink, rookie," he said. "You'll need it. Tomorrow, we're ghosts out of this place." Daniel took a sip because refusing would make him visible in a way more dangerous than drinking. The liquid burned his throat. He felt the warmth spread and settle behind his eyes. The girl sat near the pot, stirring the evening stew. Now, and then she looked up, and her gaze drifted over them like smoke. She smiled once, faint and distant, as though the expression belonged to someone else. Jenkins told a story about a carnival in Kansas. Ford fell asleep halfway through his cigarette. The fire cracked and hissed, and the jungle outside pulsed with the low murmur of frogs. Inside that circle of light, the war felt far away, as if it had belonged to other men entirely. Daniel caught her humming again, the same tune as before, soft and slow. It threaded through the noise of laughter and rain, tying the sounds together into something almost tender. When her eyes met his, the melody stopped. She didn't look away. He wanted to ask her name, but his tongue stayed still. He knew the answer would ruin the fragile balance between them. The next few days passed under the same gray ceiling. Miller checked the perimeter each morning, and each morning found nothing. The men grew lazier, less careful. They argued over small things. Who took the last ration? Whose turn it was to guard? The girl became invisible again, her quiet work fading into the background hum of survival. Only Daniel noticed that the leaves she collected changed color. "Cheatsitter so sainter." Some she dried beside the fire. Some she ground into powder between stones. He thought of asking what they were for, but something in her face warned him not to. Once, when Carter mocked her accent, she laughed. It was the first sound of joy they'd heard from her, and it silenced them more effectively than any scream could have. For a heartbeat, they all felt human again, and then the moment dissolved into nervous laughter. Daniel watched her retreat behind her calm. He knew that laugh hadn't been surrender, it had been precision. At night he dreamed of rivers running backward, of ash falling like snow. He woke to find his palms slick with sweat and his rifle across his chest. The rain outside whispered like breath against the canvas. Somewhere, someone murmured his name, or maybe it was just the jungle practicing language. One afternoon, while the others napped, he found her near the edge of camp, kneeling by a cluster of small white flowers. She crushed a petal between her fingers, leaving a pale stain on her skin. "Poison?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She shook her head. "Dream," she said. "Make dream come." He didn't know whether to be comforted or afraid. She wiped her hands on her skirt and looked toward the trees as if listening for something he could not hear. That evening, Miller announced that command had finally responded. Extraction would come in 3 days. The men cheered, loud and ragged. Carter kissed the air. Jenkins danced clumsily. Ford said he'd burn the camp himself before leaving it to rot. The girl's eyes flicked from face to face, reading the celebration with quiet precision. When she turned away, Daniel saw her mouth a word he couldn't catch. The last night before the storm broke, Daniel found her by the stream again. She was washing a cloth in the dark water, her reflection shifting like a ghost. "You'll be free soon," he said. She didn't look up. "No," she replied. "Only you." The answer sank between them, too heavy to move. He thought about reaching for her hand, but the distance between guilt and touch was too wide. Instead, he asked, "What's your name?" She wrung out the cloth, water streaming down her arms like glass. "Name is gone," she said. "You keep it if you find." Then she walked past him, back toward the campfire's dim pulse. That night the air was restless. The frogs went silent. The fire burned lower than usual, its smoke trailing in thin, uncertain lines. Miller sat apart, eyes on the tree line. "Weather's turning," he muttered. Daniel didn't answer. He watched the girl move between shadows, refilling cups, adding wood to the fire, her body a calm outline against the noise. When she handed him a bowl of stew, her fingers brushed his for the first time. The touch was light, deliberate, a message, though he didn't yet know its meaning. The liquor passed again, slower now. The men's voices softened, words melting into laughter, laughter into humming. Carter slumped sideways, half asleep. Jenkins sang a line of a song he didn't finish. Outside, lightning flashed, followed by a long, rolling sigh of thunder. The girl looked up at the sky and whispered something to herself. Daniel watched her, heart unsteady, the realization forming like a shape in fog. She was waiting for something, an ending, or a beginning that would hurt the same. The rain came in earnest, drumming against the canvas, filling every silence. Daniel closed his eyes and tried to imagine home, but all he could see was her face framed by firelight, calm, unreadable. He wondered if mercy had a sound, and if it did, whether it would be louder than guilt. When he opened his eyes, she was still watching him, and the night around them felt poised, like a held breath before night falls. Morning arrived softer than it had any right to be. The rain thinned to a veil, light pooled in the clearings, and the camp took its first easy breath in days. The girl moved through that breath like someone who had been born inside it, quiet, steady, sleeves rolled to the elbow as she scrubbed tin with sand and leaf. She hummed a fragment of melody that had followed them for weeks, and never once resolved. The men let it pass over them, and, for the first time, let it make them gentle. Carter claimed he slept better when she sang. Jenkins said the stew tasted richer lately, like home had finally remembered how to find them. Even Miller let the corners of his mouth relax into something that almost resembled peace. Ford joked that the jungle had adopted them. Thomas wrote in his notebook again, the lines less jagged. The camp felt, for a few hours, like a place where no one would have to pay later for feeling human. Daniel watched, wary of the comfort. He had seen how relief could sharpen rather than blunt a blade. He noted small alterations that the others mistook for devotion. The way she paused at the edge of the stream as if asking permission from something deeper than water. The way she held a plant in her hand a beat longer than necessary. Thumb testing the vein. The way she tasted the air before she added anything to the pot. Her hands had learned the weight of the camp, how to distribute it, how to lighten it in the places that groaned. By noon, Miller ordered a gear check and had them walk the old perimeter as if it were new. Daniel and Ford took the northern line, where the ground climbed, and the trees thinned just enough to suggest sky. Ford talked about his brother's wedding in letters that never arrived, about a dog that would not stop waiting at a porch that no longer existed. Daniel nodded when pauses asked him to, counting tripwire knots, testing stakes, reading the script of leaves bent by feet that had not returned. Back in camp, Carter told the girl to sit nearer the fire when they ate. "So we can hear the song." She obeyed with a small tilt of the head that managed to be neither assent nor refusal. When she set bowls down, she brushed the rim with a cloth. When she straightened, her eyes flicked across their faces, quick, balanced, as if weighing each man against a measure only she knew. Jenkins laughed too loud at something O'Hara said and apologized to no one, which was how men apologized out here. The change the men loved most arrived like a clever lie. The girl began to smile, not often, not wide, but enough to convince Carter that she had come around to the side of the living. She smiled when Miller passed her a canteen and did not take credit for it. She smiled when Ford tried to teach her a word and failed. She smiled when Thomas's pencil snapped and he swore softly, and then softer still. Each smile was a small lantern, and men who had been stumbling in the dark stepped closer to its heat. Daniel felt the light and did not step in. He had learned that warmth could be the shape a trap borrowed to look kind. He had learned that some smiles were the last tools left to people who could no longer afford knives. Still, the part of him that had not burned took inventory. The steadier breathing, the song that gently fixed frayed edges, the food that calmed bellies, and, maybe more, soothed dreams. He wanted, true as bone, to believe this was the portion of grace the world sometimes folded back toward the undeserving. In the afternoons, when tasks thinned and boredom swelled, the girl would ask for permission with a glance and slip into the trees with a small basket cut from bamboo. She returned with the same basket altered, leaves of different shapes layered like secrets, stems tied with vines no thicker than twine, roots brushed clean as if they had been taught manners. She worked them on a flat stone near the fire, hands moving in circles, pulps separating into shades, green the color of jade fog, brown that remembered bark, yellow like old paper. When Jenkins asked if it was medicine, she nodded. When Carter asked what for, she said stomach, and sleep, and small hurt, and those words fit neatly into the holes the men had available. Daniel tried to look away when she looked at him. He failed. Their gazes found each other the way water finds a route downhill, inevitable, patient, silent. Once, when he brought a stack of wet shirts to the line, she reached for one at the same time. Their fingers met. The touch was workmanlike, not tender, but it held. He waited for her to withdraw. She did not. For a heartbeat, he felt what he had not let himself name since the village burned. Recognition. Small and exact. The kind that makes rescue imaginable. Later, while cleaning his rifle under the awning, Daniel heard Carter telling a new version of an old story, how he'd saved a buddy by pulling him from a river that didn't want to give him back. He had told this story before. This time it ended with a different punchline, one that involved fate owing him pleasure. The men laughed in the way men laugh when they need approval more than breath. The girl, stirring the stew, Karat, watched the reflection of Carter's mouth moving in the surface of the liquid, not the man himself. Evening brought a wind cool enough to make the lantern flame tighten. Miller's radio murmured with life, and then fell silent again, as if embarrassed to have tried. When the bottle came out, Carter offered the girl a thimble of liquor. She took it with a steady hand and touched it to her lips, eyes on his, then set it down untasted. Carter called her a tease. She smiled in a way that suggested he had been gently corrected. When darkness gathered, she moved, once, deliberate, toward Daniel's tent, and paused with the curtain in her hand. He lifted his head. She let the flap fall, and knelt just outside instead. He shifted to the threshold and sat facing her through canvas as thin as an old shirt. Between them lay the hush that made speaking a choice rather than an instinct. "You don't touch me," she said finally. Each word placed carefully, as if it might break. "No," he answered. "Why?" He had said it before to her, and to himself, and yet it felt untrue every time, because war already did. Her eyes did not soften at the line. They deepened. "You think that, Mercy," she said, not asking. He looked at his hands. "I don't know what it is. After a beat, I know what it isn't." She waited. When he offered nothing more, she nodded once, the way a person marks down a fact that may later prove useful. "One day," she said, "you will understand." The sentence arrived without ornament, and took up residence in him. He thought of answering with a promise he could not keep. Instead, he said nothing, which was the closest thing to an oath he still believed. From then on, the men talked about her like weather. "She's better now," Carter said, meaning she was easier to ignore. "She's one of us," Jenkins said, meaning pain had trained her into familiar shapes. Ford claimed she'd learned to laugh at the right places in his stories. Thomas sketched the curve of her shoulder in the margin of a letter he would never send. Miller didn't speak about her at all, which was its own kind of verdict. Daniel noted the new pattern. At meals she sat closer to the center of the circle, but not close enough to be trapped. When she served drinks, she finished with him, and set the cup down instead of handing it over. When she sang, she turned away from the fire, and faced the trees as if performing for an audience that had survived longer than men. In the pot, the stew tasted of smoke, and something else he could not name, an herb that softened edges, or memory boiled down until it was safe enough to swallow. He lay awake that night, listening for the sound of anything that would explain the shape the days were taking. The jungle replied the way old judges reply, by refusing to repeat themselves. He thought of the sentence she had given him as if it were a tool. He thought of tools the way soldiers think of them, as companions that do not betray if you care for them, as weapons if you must. He did not want her words to be a weapon. He knew they already were. Around midnight he heard the softest version of the camp, Carter snoring through his mouth, Jenkins whimpering, and then stopping, Ford turning once, and not again, Miller shifting just enough to prove he was still in charge of his body. Then another sound, distinct because it did not belong to men. Her, separating leaves in the dark by touch alone, the whisper of stalk against stalk, the small, quick breath a person takes when a measurement is exact. Daniel closed his eyes and let the pattern enter him. He did not ask what it would add up to. He had begun, without noticing, to love her for the arithmetic. The next morning, sunlight filtered through a thin mist, pale and reluctant. The camp smelled of damp ash and boiled rice. Men moved slowly, tired not from work, but from something heavier, waiting. Miller sat near the radio again, adjusting dials that never answered. Carter shaved with a dull blade, his reflection wavering in a metal cup. Jenkins hummed a tune that borrowed pieces from the girl's song, mangled it into something that fit his mouth. No one corrected him. The girl worked in silence. She carried water from the stream, ground herbs on a flat rock, and dried leaves in small bundles tied with vines. Daniel noticed that she no longer asked permission to leave camp. She simply drifted into the trees when she pleased, and returned as though the jungle itself had borrowed her, and brought her back unharmed. Miller allowed it because he wanted the illusion of order, and illusions were all they had. At noon, Carter called out for her to bring the meal. She came, placed the pot beside the fire, and ladled stew into their cups. The smell was richer than before, meat, spices, something sweet and earthy. Jenkins closed his eyes after the first bite, and groaned. "You'll make us soft, girl." Carter laughed, reaching for a second helping. Daniel watched her fingers move, steady as a clock. She met his gaze once, briefly, and he caught a question there, or maybe a warning. He couldn't tell. Later, when the others rested, Daniel found her at the edge of camp, squatting near the roots of a great fig tree. She held a small bundle of cloth in her lap, turning it slowly in her hands. When she noticed him, she covered it and smiled in that distant way that meant go back. He almost did, but curiosity had grown into something sharper. "What's in there?" he asked quietly. She looked down. "Home," she said. He waited for her to continue, but she didn't. The word hung between them, impossible and final. Then she added, almost too soft to hear, I carry it, so I don't forget." He wanted to ask if she meant her village, her family, her name, but her eyes told him the conversation was over. Some truths were traps for both the asker and the keeper. He nodded and left her to her silence. When he returned, Carter was drinking again. The others joined him, grateful for distraction. The bottle circled, their laughter growing louder, rougher. Miller sat apart, pretending not to hear. Daniel tried to read his expression, command or resignation, but found neither. Carter gestured at the girl. "You know, she ain't so bad now," he said. "Learns quick. Learns what keeps her alive." Ford grinned. "Maybe she'll come home with you." Carter. "Maybe," Carter said, eyes narrowing. "If she behaves." Jenkins barked a laugh and choked on it. The sound turned into coughing that wouldn't stop. Daniel stood. "Me doi Daniel sao mini ni Daniel stub," meaning to intervene. But the girl was already there, pressing a cup of water into Jenkins's hand. Her face showed concern, but Daniel saw her watching Carter through the corner of her eye. Calculating. Measuring. That night, the rain returned in sheets. The jungle became one long sound. Daniel lay awake, counting the rhythm. He heard her footsteps outside, light, deliberate. He wanted to speak, to call her name that wasn't a name, but the weight of silence pinned him down. The canvas trembled with wind. Somewhere, someone whispered, and he couldn't tell if it came from inside the tent or from the trees. By dawn, the air smelled of smoke again. Miller announced that they would begin packing to move within 2 days if the radio remained dead. The men cheered without conviction. The girl kept her head low, eyes on her work. Daniel saw her mouth tighten, a small flicker of tension she hid almost immediately. Whatever she waited for, it was close. When Carter noticed Daniel watching her, his grin returned, crueler this time. "You look at her too much. Reeves," he said, "makes me wonder which side you're on." Daniel's jaw stiffened. "There are no sides left." Carter laughed. "That's what the losing side says." Miller barked his name, shutting him up, but the damage was done. The camp's fragile order cracked a little. The laughter that followed had teeth. The girl stirred the fire, pretending not to hear. After the meal, Daniel walked the perimeter alone. The jungle pressed close, wet and indifferent. He thought of the girl's hands grinding leaves, of the word home whispered into the rain, of Carter's voice thick with arrogance. He knew something was coming. He could feel it in the quiet that lived between each breath. When he returned, the camp felt wrong, too calm. The men were relaxed in a way that didn't belong to soldiers. Jenkins was asleep, his mouth open. Ford was humming. Carter reclined against a log, cup in hand, smiling like a man who believed the world had forgiven him. The girl knelt by the pot, stirring slowly. The air shimmered with heat and anticipation. Miller caught Daniel's eye. "We move tomorrow," he said. "Celebrate tonight. Then we're done with this place." Daniel nodded, though his stomach turned. The girl's song drifted up again, softer than ever, wrapping around the camp like smoke. She looked at him once across the fire and gave the smallest nod, as if to say, "Remember." That night he dreamed of rivers overflowing their banks, carrying away everything built too close to the edge. When he woke, the camp was silent except for rain, and the taste of metal filled his mouth. The morning after felt hollow. The rain had stopped, but the jungle kept dripping as if it hadn't been told. The camp was quiet. Too quiet. Daniel walked among the tents, noting small details the others missed, how the fire pit had been cleaned too thoroughly, how the pot sat empty, but smelled faintly of something sharp, how the girl was nowhere to be seen. Miller stood near the radio, cigarette between his fingers, staring at nothing. "Where is she?" Daniel asked. Miller shrugged. "Probably down by the stream." Don't worry. She always comes back." Carter laughed from behind. "You sound jealous? Reeves, let the girl have her bath." The others chuckled, thin and tired. The sound scattered into the trees like birds startled by their own wings. Daniel didn't answer. He found her near the water, kneeling by the roots of a tree, washing something small and dark from her hands. Her sleeves were rolled high, her hair pinned back. When she looked up, her eyes were calm. "Morning," he said. She nodded. "Soon you go." He hesitated. "You want us gone?" She dipped her hands again. "No want happen." He wanted to tell her she could come with them, though he didn't know to where. Fights her she stay. Hatistan Badebortor. Instead, he asked, "What will you do after?" "Same," she said. "Still live." Then she smiled, a strange, weary smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Still remember." He watched her wring out the cloth she held. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw a stain spreading across the water, faint and red. But it could have been reflection. When they returned to camp, Carter was already half drunk. He'd found another bottle hidden under supplies. The men were restless, pretending the war was ending just because they were leaving a corner of it behind. Miller let them have their illusion. He was too tired to police joy. The girl prepared their meal as usual, humming under her breath. The pot steamed with a familiar aroma: rice, meat, a hint of herbs. Daniel sat apart, watching her hands. She worked slower than before, careful, deliberate. Every motion seemed part of a rhythm only she could hear. When Carter offered her a cup of liquor, she accepted it, raised it to her lips, and took the smallest sip. The men cheered as if witnessing a miracle. Miller grunted approval. Daniel felt a weight settle in his chest. She smiled, then soft and fleeting. "Good?" Jenkins asked. She nodded. "Good." That single word loosened something in the camp. Laughter came easier. The bottle passed from hand to hand. Miller allowed himself a real smile, brief and uncertain. The girl poured another round, refilling each cup with quiet grace. Daniel didn't drink at first. He held the cup, feeling its warmth seep into his palm. She noticed. Their eyes met across the fire. Her expression said nothing, and everything. He drank. The liquor burned the same as before, maybe sweeter. His head grew light, his thoughts slow. He saw the others laughing, Carter slapping Jenkins on the back, Ford trying to stand, and failing. The firelight doubled, swayed. The girl's song returned, so faint it might have been inside his skull. The words were not English, not meant to be understood. He heard them anyway, somewhere below hearing. Then her voice stopped. The laughter faded. Carter's grin slipped. The lantern's flame trembled, stretched, and went thin. The jungle pressed closer, listening. Daniel blinked hard. The world tilted, edges softening. His limbs felt heavy, his breath thick. He tried to speak, but his tongue wouldn't shape words. Through the haze, he saw her stand, slowly, gracefully, as though rising from a prayer. She moved from man to man, brushing her hand over their shoulders. The motion was tender, almost a blessing. Miller tried to lift his head and failed. Jenkins murmured something that could have been her name. She looked down at him, eyes full of something older than pity. Daniel's vision blurred. He saw her pause beside him, the knife glinting faintly in her hand. Her face was serene. She touched his cheek with her fingertips, a gesture lighter than breath. Then she whispered, "Sleep." The world obeyed. When he woke, dawn had bled into the sky. The fire was cold. His body felt leaden, his mouth dry. A low groan came from the other tent, then another. He forced himself upright. Around him, the camp lay in ruin, clothes torn, supplies scattered, men half-conscious, pale as ghosts. Carter was curled on his side, whimpering. Ford stared at the sky with eyes that wouldn't focus. Miller sat slumped against a post, hands shaking as he tried to light a cigarette. The match flared, died, flared again. When Daniel looked closer, he saw the blood. No one spoke her name. No one had to. She was gone. A path of footprints led toward the jungle, small, deliberate, vanishing where the grass grew high. The air smelled of iron and rain. Daniel found his rifle still leaning by the door, untouched. A small bundle was missing from the corner of his tent, the one wrapped in cloth, tied with care. He followed the prints as far as he dared until the trees swallowed light. He called once, quietly, not expecting an answer. The silence that came back felt less like absence and more like completion. When he returned, Miller stopped him with a look. "You didn't see her," he said flatly. "Understand?" Daniel nodded. They packed the camp in silence. The radio crackled alive that afternoon, spitting orders they didn't hear. No one asked what had happened. No one wanted to know. As they marched away, Daniel looked once over his shoulder. The clearing was already fading back into the jungle, as if it had never been there. He thought of her hands grinding leaves, her whisper in the dark, "You will understand." He did. She had spared him not to save him, but to make him remember. The jungle swallowed the path behind him, and the rain began again, erasing what little trace remained. Dawn crept into the camp without courage. A pale light seeped between leaves, touched the edges of torn canvas, and stopped. The air smelled of wet ash and liquor. Nothing moved but the slow drip of water from the tarp. Daniel woke first. The world arrived in fragments, smoke, mud, silence, and a headache that felt like another heartbeat behind his eyes. He pushed himself upright and found the cup still beside his hand, overturned. The liquid sunk into the dirt. Around him, bodies, not dead, breathing, twitching, groaning, but wrong. Carter lay curled on his side, eyes open, but blank, a sound leaking from his throat that might once have been laughter. Jenkins sat against a post, staring at his own hands as if unsure they belonged to him. Ford was on his knees, rocking, muttering a name that didn't belong to anyone here. Thomas was face down, motionless except for the tremor in his shoulders. Miller was awake, barely. He sat near the cold fire, rifle across his knees, smoke rising from the cigarette that had gone out hours ago. His face looked carved from something that had forgotten how to bleed. Daniel's mouth was dry. His tongue felt like cloth. He tried to speak, and failed. The girl, gone. A trail of footprints led away from camp, neat and narrow, vanishing into the tall grass beyond the clearing. A corner of the pot still steamed, the smell faintly sweet, almost medicinal. He stood, swaying. The trees tilted with him. "Sarge," he said. Miller didn't look up. "Don't." Don't." The word landed like a slap. The old authority was gone from it, but the habit of obedience survived. Daniel shut his mouth. Carter made a noise, then a hoarse, broken thing that ended in a sob. Jenkins turned and vomited into the mud. Ford looked at his own body, eyes wide with animal panic. Miller didn't move. Daniel knelt beside him. "We need a medic." Miller laughed once, short and mean. "Closest one's in Da Nang." He looked at the men sprawled around them. "Think they'd make it that far?" Daniel didn't answer. He followed Miller's gaze to the empty corner of camp where the girl used to sleep. Her blanket was gone, her basket, the bundle of cloth she had guarded like a shrine. Miller reached for his rifle, checked the chamber out of habit, then lowered it again. "Report says ambush," he muttered. "If anyone asks, Daniel stared at him. "That's what you're going to tell them?" "That's what they'll believe." He wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Outside the clearing, the jungle waited, listening. The sound of rain starting again filled the silence. By mid-morning, the men could stand, some barely. Miller ordered them to pack. No one protested. They moved like ghosts through the wreckage, folding canvas, collecting scattered gear, avoiding each other's eyes. No one spoke the girl's name. Daniel walked the perimeter once more. The footprints were fading under rain. He followed them until they disappeared entirely, swallowed by green. A few paces farther, he found something small glinting in the mud. A silver button. One of theirs, sewn into the edge of a strip of fabric torn from her dress. He picked it up and closed his hand around it. It felt warm, though it shouldn't have. Back in camp, Miller gave the order to move. "We tell command we were hit in the night," he said. "They got through the wire, took what they could. We fought them off." His voice carried no conviction. It didn't need to. Carter limped past, eyes empty. Jenkins followed, muttering a prayer half in English, half in nothing. Ford carried the radio that no longer worked. Thomas walked without direction, his hand pressed to his stomach like he was holding something in. Daniel fell in at the rear. The rain grew heavier, disguising their tracks, washing everything into one long smear. Hours later, as the jungle closed behind them, Miller stumbled. Daniel caught his arm. "You need rest." Miller shook his head. "I need to forget." They walked on until the sound of the stream returned. Miller stopped there, looking into the water. "You think she's still alive?" he asked, almost to himself. "Yes," Daniel said. "It wasn't faith. It was fact." Miller nodded once, as if that settled something. "Then she's already won." He dropped his cigarette into the current and watched it vanish. When they reached the extraction point the next morning, the chopper came late. The pilot shouted for them to hurry, but none of them did. The rain soaked everything, even the noise, as they climbed aboard. Daniel turned back, through the blur of rotors, and missed. He thought he saw her standing at the edge of the trees, a small figure, unmoving, hair lifted by the wind. It could have been a trick of light, or a ghost, or a truth too heavy for the world to keep. She raised her hand once, palm open, and the jungle swallowed her again. Daniel closed his eyes. When the helicopter lifted, the camp below dissolved into green. Nothing remained but rain, and the sound of blades cutting through it, steady, merciless, like time itself finishing a job no one had ordered. The flight out was short, but it felt endless. Rain hammered against the metal skin of the helicopter, turning every breath into a vibration. None of the men spoke. Jenkins stared through the open door at the blur of jungle below, lips moving soundlessly. Ford held his helmet in both hands as though it might keep his head from coming apart. Carter dozed, mouth open, twitching at invisible hands. Miller sat rigid beside the door gunner, eyes on the horizon that refused to arrive. Daniel watched the jungle shrink into a single green mass until it stopped being a place and became an idea again. Distant, shapeless, patient. The smell of smoke clung to his clothes, to his skin, even to the small button hidden in his fist. He told himself he would drop it when they landed. He didn't. At the base, doctors met them first, then questions. "Ambush," Miller said, and the others repeated it. The words came easy, flat as memorized lines. The medics worked fast, cutting open uniforms, pressing bandages, asking nothing that mattered. The damage was done in ways medicine couldn't name. The men flinched when touched, but didn't bleed. That night, after the reports were signed and the morphine ran out, Daniel sat outside the infirmary. The rain followed them even here, lighter, but constant, as if it had hitched a ride. Somewhere down the corridor, Carter was shouting in his sleep, a sound between laughter and pleading. Jenkins prayed again. Ford vomited quietly into a bucket. Miller appeared in the doorway, cigarette glowing like a dying eye. "You didn't tell them," he said. Daniel shook his head. "Would they listen?" Miller exhaled. "Doesn't matter. They'll write what they want anyway." They stood in silence, watching the rain. After a moment, Miller said, "You saw her go?" "Yes." "Alive?" "Yes." Miller nodded. "Then we leave it there." He started to turn, then paused. "You think she'll ever stop?" Daniel thought of the bundle she'd carried, of her steady hands, and the calm after the song. "No," he said. "Neither will I." Miller smiled without humor. "That's what I was afraid of." Then he walked away, swallowed by the pale light of the corridor. Weeks passed. They scattered. Transfers, discharges, hospitals. The Army preferred its ghosts well organized. Daniel drifted between barracks and paperwork, the days dissolving into the same gray. He told no one about the girl. He didn't need to. The silence carried her more faithfully than any story could. Sometimes, in sleep, he returned to the clearing. The fire still burned there, clean and steady. She sat beside it, humming to herself, head tilted as if listening to something beyond the reach of sound. When he tried to step closer, the jungle grew between them again, each leaf a memory that refused translation. When he woke, he carried the weight of that music in his chest until it became the rhythm of his breath. One evening, months later, he passed Carter in a hospital corridor. The man's face had changed, pale, shrunken, eyes turned inward. He didn't notice Daniel at first, then did, and froze. For a moment they simply looked at each other, two remnants pretending to be men. Carter's lips moved. "She was a witch," he whispered. "You know that, right?" Daniel didn't answer. He could see the tremor in Carter's hands, the slow panic of someone who had started to understand his own punishment. The nurse came, then, guiding him away. And the echo of that word, witch, followed Daniel down the hall like smoke. He left the base soon after, back home. America had already moved on. The war played on televisions between commercials. People thanked him in grocery lines. He learned how to nod and make it look like gratitude. At night he sat by the window of his small apartment, listening to rain on the glass. Sometimes it sounded like the jungle calling from another century. He kept the button on his desk, a small, harmless thing. He told himself it meant nothing, but when he picked it up, the metal held warmth, as though it remembered touch. He would close his hand around it, and the hum of the old song would return, faint and persistent. He thought of finding her, of returning, of trying to trade explanation for peace. But he knew what she had told him was final. Still live, still remember. That was the closest thing to forgiveness he would ever be offered. Years later, West Central resurfaced, and a sad and show incident classified as enemy assault, survivors repatriated, no civilian casualties recorded. He didn't correct them. Lies had always traveled faster than truth. The jungle didn't need witnesses. It needed memory, and he had become that. Sometimes he dreamed of seeing her again, older, standing by a river whose name he didn't know. In those dreams, she never spoke. She only looked at him with the same calm as before, the calm of someone who had already decided what the story meant. He would try to speak, to ask for something, an answer, a reprieve, but she would turn away, and the sound of rain would rise until it swallowed them both. When he woke, he understood that she had spared him not out of mercy, not even out of recognition, but to leave him as evidence that one man had watched, remembered, and could not lie to himself ever again. The jungle remembers what men forget. And Daniel Reeves, no longer a soldier, no longer young, carried that memory like a scar he had chosen to keep. In the years that followed, the war kept ending, and then starting again inside the men who had survived it. On paper, they were home. In the soft theater of public memory, they were welcomed, debated, thanked, condemned, forgotten, often in the same sentence. But the jungle had not released them. It had only changed its address. It lived in lockers and kitchen drawers, in the chemical tang of laundromats, in the distance between a question and an answer at the dinner table. It breathed through late-night televisions, sat at the edge of mattresses at 3 in the morning, and learned the shape of every room where a man might try and fail to sleep. They found jobs that asked nothing about jungles. Carter drove a truck across states he could not name without looking at the map. He learned to measure distance by the number of motels he could endure before a mirror undid him. Jenkins stocked shelves at a grocery store where the sprinkler system hissed like 1,000 snakes at closing time. Ford sold used cars with a smile that never convinced himself. Thomas started something like a marriage and protected it by never speaking above a whisper. Miller carried silence into a small house whose windows faced a field that didn't mind being stared at. Then came the exams, routine, administrative, meant to satisfy a system that loved the purity of forms more than the thickness of lives. Men who had learned to walk without looking at their own bodies were asked to stand in rooms where light made everything simple and impossible at once. A doctor, bored and careful, wrote on a clipboard. Another doctor, younger and eager, suggested a specialist. Questions bloomed, technical and clean. The answers bled. Rumor did what rumor does. It acquired names, streets, particularities that made it feel honest. The squad with no manhood, someone said, not kindly. Ambushed, another added, for decency's sake. Strange case, a third concluded, with the professional interest of a person who didn't know he was eavesdropping on a prayer. The words grew legs and walked through bars and union halls, through waiting rooms where magazines told gentler lies, through family kitchens where plates were rinsed a little too loudly. The men stopped meeting each other's eyes. Laughter retreated to basements. A few tried to explain. Explanation, it turned out, was a tide that took everything else out to sea. Newspapers never caught the story quite right. Some leaned on the word tragedy until it broke. Others preferred mystery, as if the jungle were a magician, and the men had been sawed in half for applause. None of them were interested in the precise shape of shame. Shame has no headline. It stains from the inside. Carter stopped driving at night because the white lines on the highway became knives. He stopped driving by day when the horizon started talking. He took a job in a warehouse and learned how to carry boxes that weighed exactly as much as memory. Jenkins married quietly, divorced quietly, discovered faith in a storefront church where the hymns were short and merciful. Ford counted the cars he sold, and then the drinks he needed to sleep after selling them. Thomas wrote a letter in which he told the truth, and then burned it in a coffee can on his balcony. Miller found work as a security guard and wore his old authority like a coat in summer. It did not fit, but it hid the skin. Daniel Reeves lived more carefully than the others. He rented an apartment that forgot him when he left and forgave him when he returned. He worked at a hardware store where people asked for nails in sensible numbers. On his lunch breaks, he walked by the river and made bargains with water. He did not date. He did not explain. When someone asked about the war, he said the sentence the country liked to hear, and then went home to let silence correct it. He kept a button in a drawer and took it out only when the room could stand to hear a story without words. At night he dreamed of a camp dissolving under rain. The dreams were precise. The lantern guttered in exactly the same way. The stew boiled at a patient tempo. The song rose and did not resolve. He saw her hands, small, deliberate, calm, and the space her body had made around the fire, a border without a fence. He remembered the moment her face changed from witness to decision. He woke with the word "understand" in his mouth, and found that it did not dissolve when he swallowed. Time taught him new arithmetic, how to count months by the number of questions he had not asked, how to measure a year by the distance between mercy. He learned the city's seasons, which were not really seasons at all, only different flavors of gray. He grew older in a manner he could not detect from the inside. Mirrors performed their small cruelties and were covered with towels for weeks. What pulled him back was not courage, it was gravity. A sentence spoken under canvas, a child's shoe half seen in ash, the way the jungle had paused as if listening on the night. The camp fell apart. These were weights that never stopped finding the seam. He began saving without acknowledging the plan. He folded bills into an envelope and hid it behind the radiator. He bought a passport. He visited the library and copied place names onto index cards. He learned that the distances on maps were jokes the world told to make itself feel manageable. Miller answered the phone when Daniel called. They had not spoken in years, and yet the voice arrived like a familiar weather. "Don't," Miller said after the third sentence. "I have to." "No, you want to—" "That's different. I can't tell which is which." Miller exhaled. "You won't find peace there." "I don't want peace." "What, then?" Daniel looked at his hands, at the line where the left palm had a scar from a nail driven wrong. To carry it correctly, he said. Silence. Then the sound of a man remembering how to be kind. "If you see her," Miller said, "tell her nothing." He paused. "Tell her everything. Hell, tell her the weather. She'll know which to keep." The flight back across the world was a long subtraction, hours pulled from sleep, days shaved from certainty. He sat among strangers who slept with their mouths open and dreamed nothing heavier than a missed connection. The plane landed in heat that smelled like fruit. From the window the landscape looked familiar and not a collage made by a patient hand. He took a bus that insisted on filling every seat and then the aisle. He took another bus that did not pretend. He watched roadside altars blur into ribbons of color. Every kilometer peeled something from him. Politeness first, then the small pride of knowing where one is, then the armor of language. He learned how to point, how to smile without demanding an answer, how to let the world misunderstand him graciously. He learned that kindness was a currency, and that he had enough. He slept in rooms with doors that did not believe in locks. He woke to roosters and a clock that preferred the sun. The closer he came to where the camp had been, the quieter the country grew inside him. The jungle was still there, but older, like a god who had made peace with its worshippers. Roads that had been mud were now narrow ribbons of asphalt with patience for bicycles. Children waved. The faces of the old did not flicker when they saw him. History had taught them that ghosts travel without luggage. He found the river by smell before he saw it. The water still carried the old iron in its breath. He followed a footpath that worked around a bend, and then another. A young man pointed him toward a village with a nod that contained no curiosity. The houses were wood and roof and shadow. You could hear cooking before you could see kitchens. You could hear laughter as if it grew from the dirt. He asked no one for her name. He had no name to ask with. He walked until the path decided to end, and the fields began. The rice was the green of a thought remembered exactly. Wind passed through it and made a sound like prayer. if prayer could be humble enough to keep its voice low. At the edge of the fields a woman stood with a basket on her hip. She was not young, and not old. Her hair, tied back, had made room for gray. Her face had settled into the kind of calm one usually must earn. She turned toward him not in surprise, but with the recognition of someone who had been expecting a particular weather and was not disappointed to see it arrive. She looked at him and did not look away. Daniel stopped 10 paces from her. Words assembled and then disbanded. He thought of introducing himself to a person who had already named him long ago. He could feel the button in his pocket, the small anchor he had carried across oceans, heatless and heavy. They stood like that for a time that made clocks irrelevant. A child's voice came from the house behind them. Then the child herself, barefoot, quick, holding a chipped cup, as if it were treasure. She had hair the color of a field when the sun thinks about evening. She had eyes the blue of a sky the jungle never let you see. She looked at Daniel the way children look at animals they have been warned not to fear. "Hello," he said, surprised at the sound of his own English in this place. The child tilted her head. The woman said something soft to the girl, who nodded, and retreated to the doorway, leaving the cup on a step as if planting a flag. The woman set her basket down. When she spoke, the voice was older than the face, or perhaps the other way around. "I knew you would come," she said. The English was careful. The way one handles a blade one has sharpened personally. "I didn't," he answered. "That is why you did." He looked at the fields because the fields could absorb mistakes. "I brought nothing. You brought what you have." Her gaze touched the pocket where the button slept. Fencer and Farfan moved back to his eyes. "You kept it." He nodded. They walked to the house, and she poured water into a bowl and set it before him as if receiving a guest from the next village. The child watched from the doorway, her face serious, the way children become when they sense adults rearranging furniture inside their lives. Daniel drank in small sips because thirst was greed in a place like this. The water tasted like stone and forgiveness. "You are well," he said, and knew it was a foolish sentence. "I am alive," she answered. Sometimes that is the same. He wanted to say her name, and could not find it. He wanted to ask the child's, and was afraid of the answer already pounding at the door. The house held them without ceremony. A clock ticked that might have been a beetle. A fan moved the air, and changed nothing. "I came," he began, and stopped. Any ending to that sentence would be a lie to someone. "You came," she said, as if that were the entire truth, and therefore generous. He placed the button on the table. It sat there, an ordinary object suddenly exhausted by the distance it had traveled. She looked at it the way one looks at a pebble picked from a dead person's pocket. The child leaned in, curious and uninvited, and then leaned back, sensing laws older than herself. "We have a field behind the house," the woman said. "You will see it in evening. The wind makes a sound there I like." She lifted her eyes to his. "You can stay if you know how to be quiet." He nodded because speaking would have broken something still being built. He understood that permission was not absolution. It was a place to stand while the verdict took its time. Outside, the rice moved like a sea that had learned patience. The child retrieved her cup and held it with both hands as if the world might spill. The woman returned the button to his palm, lightly, briefly, then closed his fingers around it. "Keep what is yours," she said. "We have kept what is ours." Evening gathered on the edges of things. The room took on the color of stories. Daniel sat with his hands in his lap, feeling the shape of the small metal circle press into his skin, and realized that the weight of it had changed. Not heavier, not lighter. Correct. Night came without drama. the way it does in places that have learned how to end days gently. The light thinned, folded into itself, and left behind the small sounds that held the world together, crickets in the grass, the creak of wood settling into cooler air, the soft splash of water being poured into a metal basin. The child slept early, curled like a question that had found no one to answer it yet. Daniel sat outside the house, on a low step that still held a trace of sun. The woman, Lynn, he could call her that now, though he said it only inside his chest, moved somewhere behind him, her footsteps measured, neither welcoming nor dismissing. The air carried a smell he half recognized, wet soil, boiled rice, and the faintest whisper of rain still lingering on leaves. He looked toward the field. Fireflies drifted between stalks of rice, tracing the slow geometry of forgiveness. He tried to imagine what the land had seen, what roots remembered, the ash, the boots, the laughter, the blood, but the field refused him. It had already decided to belong to other seasons. Lynn joined him after a while. She brought tea, poured without ceremony, and handed him a cup. Steam rose between them like breath that didn't know whose it was. "You found what you were looking for?" she asked, not unkindly. He took a sip. The tea was bitter, then sweet. "I don't know what I was looking for." "That means you are honest," she said. "Honesty is heavy. You learn to carry it, or you put it down." He stared at the rim of his cup, tracing the chip on one side. "Do you hate me?" She smiled a little. "If I did, you would not be sitting here." He looked at her. The lines on her face were softer than he had imagined, like folds in old silk. "Then why?" "Because hate ends too quickly," she said. "And I waited too long." The night deepened around them, a soft engine of sounds, frogs, wind, the occasional bark of a distant dog. The world didn't seem interested in what they said or didn't say. It simply existed, full and indifferent, and in that indifference there was a kind of mercy. After a while she asked, "You remember the others?" He nodded. "Everyone." "They still alive?" "Some." He hesitated. "But not really." She studied him for a moment, then looked toward the child's window, where a dim light flickered. "You think remembering helps?" He wanted to say yes, but the truth sat elsewhere. "It keeps them from disappearing," he said instead, "even if I don't know why that matters." She folded her hands in her lap. "Disappearing is not the worst thing," she said. "Becoming someone who never remembers, that is worse." A breeze came off the fields, cool and full of whispering things. Lynn closed her eyes as if listening to them. When she opened them again, they glimmered faintly in the half-light. "She is yours," Lynn said. Daniel didn't breathe. "I thought so." "She knows," Lynn continued. "Children always do, even when you never tell them." She asked about her father once. "I told her he was a man who knew how to listen." That was enough. He nodded slowly. "Thank you." Lynn looked at him. "Don't thank me. I did not give her to you. I only gave her life. What she does with it, that is her choice." He wanted to ask if Lynn had ever forgiven herself, but he understood it was the one question he had no right to ask. When the tea cooled, she stood. "Wait here," she said, and went inside. He listened to the small domestic sounds of drawers opening, of something being moved gently from one place to another. When she returned, she carried a wooden box, old, the color of burned honey. She set it between them. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, softly, "You know what this is?" He nodded. The box was lighter than he expected when she placed it in his hands. "I kept it," she said, "not for revenge, for remembering." He opened the lid slowly. Inside were small, wrapped bundles, dark with age, sealed in cloth, and string. The air that escaped was dry and ancient. He closed it again, hands trembling, not from fear, but from the gravity of what it meant. "Why give it to me?" he asked. "Because you were the only one who never took," she said. "So now you return it for all of us." He swallowed hard. "What should I do with it?" She looked toward the horizon where the fields met the night. "Carry it where the world can't hear," she said. "Give it back to silence. That's where forgiveness lives." He didn't answer. The box felt both sacred and unbearable in his lap. Lynn turned to go, then stopped. "You think silence is peace," she said, not looking at him. "It isn't. It's only the sound of what refuses to die." Then she walked inside, leaving him with the box and the night. Weeks later, Daniel returned to America. The flight was long and sleepless, the kind that made time itself feel like an illness. He carried one bag, a notebook, and the wooden box wrapped in an old coat. Customs didn't ask. Some burdens are invisible to officials. He mailed the box to each of them, the ones who were still alive. No note, no explanation, just the box, sealed, anonymous. Carter was the first to receive his. He didn't open it. He took it into the woods behind his house, dug a hole, and buried it with a prayer he didn't remember finishing. A week later, his neighbor found him sitting there, knees in the dirt, whispering to the air. Jenkins opened his and wept until morning, then walked to the church where he had been teaching Sunday school. He left the box on the altar and didn't go back. Ford sent his to the sea. He watched it float until the tide forgot it. Miller received his last. He didn't move for a full hour. Then he called Daniel for the first time in years. "You did it," he said. Voice rough with something that wasn't anger. Daniel said nothing. "You think it helped?" Miller asked. "I don't know," Daniel said. "But it ended." Miller laughed quietly, like a man hearing a joke too late. "Not everything that ends is over." Then he hung up. Daniel kept no copy for himself. He walked the city the way some men walk through memory, slowly, knowing it would never stop changing. He lived quietly, sending money to Lynn when he could, letters to no one, and each year on the same day he lit a candle by his window and let it burn until it went out by itself. Sometimes he heard from Lynn through neighbors or travelers, a postcard with no return address, a sentence written in English that was more poetry than message. The field still listens. The child grows taller. The rain forgets nothing. He never wrote back. Some conversations are meant to last only one way. As he aged, his body betrayed him gently. A hand that trembled while pouring tea. A breath that shortened on stairs. He didn't mind. He welcomed the smaller versions of life. They were quieter. One spring evening, long after his hair had turned the color of paper ash, Daniel walked to the river near his apartment. He sat on the same bench he had used for years, watching the water carry other people's reflections away. He reached into his coat pocket and found the button. It had lost its shine, its edge dulled from decades of touch. He rolled it between his fingers, then dropped it into the river. It made no sound he could hear, but the ripples spread outward, soft and insistent, until they met the opposite bank. He imagined Lynn standing in her field at that very moment, feeling the wind change, looking up from her work, her hand brushing her daughter's shoulder. Perhaps she would think of him, perhaps not. Either way, the world would keep its balance. When he rose to leave, the sky had turned the same dim gold as the rice fields in his memory. He thought of her voice saying, "You can stay if you know how to be quiet." He had stayed. He had learned. He walked home through streets that smelled of rain and old engines. The city hummed softly, alive with its own ghosts. Before sleep took him, he thought of one last truth, the kind the jungle had whispered into his bones all those years ago. Some wounds heal only when no one speaks of them. He closed his eyes and let Silence. Bloom. The world exhaled. Somewhere, half a world away, wind moved through rice stalks like a hand through hair. And for the first time in a lifetime, Daniel Reeves slept without dreams.